Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to another episode of the Enemies List podcast. I am your host as always. I am joined today by my friend Tristan Snell, the author of a book called Taking Down Trump. He's one of the few people who's ever successfully brought a case against Trump that won. He is the host of the Tristan Snell Show, and he has a terrific Substack on tristansnell.com, and is a very smart guy about the legal mechanisms that are being abused and twisted and torqued into all out of all semblance of recognizability. So Tristan, as we are seeing last night, as we're recording this last night, we saw one of the first things that really hit the Supreme Court in the USAID case, and John Roberts kind of blinked and said, okay, yeah, Donald, you get more time to play with this. Talk to me about where you see the courts. I think there's been a lot of affirmative activity for the judicial branch. Where do you see the legal battles unfolding from here as we get higher and higher in the food chain?
Yeah, I mean, look, the kicker is that obviously there's going to be a lot of bad decision-making coming from what is undoubtedly the most corrupt and extreme Supreme Court in American history, and that's really saying something. Yeah, right? That's really... These were people who... This is an institution that declared that Black people were not human beings.
Right. Korematsu was not a moment of glory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that you can just sort of like take people and disappear them off into camps. This is not exactly, the world's best institution. And they're really, gunning for some of those low points here. Here's the thing. I think we are going to see some of these things are going to go well. Some of these things are going to go badly. But I think the overall picture is one of delay and throwing up a bunch of, I don't want to use the word guardrails, but it's just like even making these people jump through more hoops is a victory. Like anything that we can do, think of it not like a guardrail. If you're going to keep like the roadway analogy, think of it like a speed bump. Anything we can do to slow these guys down so we can mitigate the harm, and enough time that the American people are hopefully waking up, and we see a lot of signs of it now. And if you look at any of the historical record, presidents don't do well with their midterm elections, especially their first ones. And this one could be a real doozy. So, we really just need to slow him down for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's actually, we have to slow him down for about 9 months. The campaign will start up for the 26th elections. Correct. In earnest. I heard this morning from a source already that a number of these vulnerable Republicans in New York and California and New Jersey are begging Susie Wiles, please stop Elon Musk. Please don't kill these things in our districts. It's so bad for us. And I think that, I think you're right. It's like if the legal processes grind them down a little bit, which by the way, folks, the courts are not always meant to be like an overnight decision. They need to contemplate the legal questions here, right? I mean, and some of this seems pretty evident, like Article 1, Article 2 stuff, but some of it is going to be more fine-grained about executive power. The Supreme Court has been favorable to executive power so far, but do you think that even this court has some upper boundaries on that?
I think they do, weirdly enough. I'm not saying that I think John Roberts is going to ride to the rescue. We've had 20 years of thinking he was going to be more sensible and reasonable, and we get disappointed more often than not. That said, I think that sort of like I hate the fact that we have to call these the swing votes on the court, but you've got Roberts and Barrett and Gorsuch who potentially have some sanity remaining and that could actually step up and say, wait a minute, no, you actually can't do that, especially when it's so obvious that it's just purely for political, ideological reasons. You've got the constitutional issues that are going to come up in front of the court. And then in a number of these cases, you also have you're going to have decisions that have to get rendered on the Administrative Procedure Act, which
Yes.
which I keep on saying is the most important federal statute that most people haven't heard of.
The most important, boring federal statute.
It's extremely boring.
Yeah.
It's extremely boring, but extremely important, and it establishes all sorts of boundaries on what federal agencies can and cannot do. They can't do things. The most important one is they can't do things that are arbitrary and capricious. Gee, I wonder what sounds arbitrary and
if DOGE falls into that category, it's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can't do. There have to be fact-based policy reasons why you do something. It can't just be because I said so. Because I said so is not good enough, and that's really what they're doing is because I said so. So at some point, are we going to see the courts come in and say, you know what, you actually can't do some of these things? I do have some hope, but it's going to be a checkered record coming up.
I think that's. I mean, I've been trying to calibrate people's expectations and level set for a lot of folks that we will lose some of these cases.
We are. We're definitely
some of these cases are not going to go. I hope that we don't lose. I hope we lose. I would trade a whole bunch of trivial things in the short run, like the mechanisms on the funding stuff. If the court would render a decision on Article 1, Article 2 separations that matter in the ability of the president to interfere with authorized and appropriated congressional funds.
Right.
That would be a check.
That would be huge.
That would be a check of all checks. That would be and honestly, I mean, Congress has abrogated a lot of its own power over the last 3 decades. They've walked back from they don't want to make as many hard votes, so they don't make as many hard votes. They go, okay, over to you, administration.
You take care of it. Not our problem.
You do it. Right.
That's right.
And while people may disagree on like Chevron, that idea that you were just going to let the executive branch decide what things meant, what all laws meant that affected that branch. I think that was a bad precedent now, and it has ended up with this sense in the Trump world, especially, that executive power is unitary and unbounded. Right.
The kicker, though, is that you've got this interesting split even within conservative legal thought on this that still is there, even though the ones that are winning are trying to pretend there isn't still a split, but there is. Chevron was originally supported by the furthest right jurists of that day, including Scalia, and back before he got totally bought, Clarence Thomas. And the thinking there was much more of sort of a Reagan, Bush, like executive power good. It means we can get things done. You know, it was more of sort of like a Teddy Roosevelt sort of like, basically a lot vigorous executive branch. So it's a good thing for the courts to have to defer, because that's what Chevron said, that the courts had to defer to the agency's interpretations of these things. Now that's gone. It turns out that was something that the right wing today really wanted, because it's allowing them to sort of take a hatchet to environmental regulations, labor regulations, a whole bunch of other things. But it turns out that not having Chevron deference could be really, really bad if Republicans are in power and now they're the ones running the agencies. Courts are going to look at them and be like, we don't care that this is what you think you get to do. Chevron's dead. You killed it.
You told us to interpret. You told us to say what the law means in this case, and we're saying what it means.
And then they're turning around and now saying, like, the president alone gets to determine what the law is. You know, I do think that I don't want to put too much of our hope in some of these actors to care about the institutions that they serve in and think to themselves like, wow, my power is being stripped. But there is something to that a lot of these people, because if Trump's more fascistic interpretations on these things carry the day, then it completely erodes the power of these other people. And I do think you're starting to see committee chairs on the Hill, and then potentially some of these Supreme Court justices being like, if I rule in this particular way or decide this in this certain way, I'm meaningless. And maybe I don't want to come out with a decision here that makes me meaningless.
While I don't think John Roberts is going to play the hero,
no,
I do think he still has some idea that the court and its institutional prerogatives matter.
Correct. And it's important to him. It's a self-serving thing.
Sure.
Right? It's both, which is where I think we'll get the most help from these people, is when it's actually in their personal interest to feel powerful, to get reelected, whatever it is.
Well, I mean, the personal interest on the electoral side, that is definitely starting to brew up inside the Republican Party. They're making like I said, right now they're quietly calling Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, and begging and pleading with her, and texting the president, begging and pleading with him. But it's going to become more acute as we go forward. It's going to become more painful as we go forward. But with the courts right now, they have some pretty smart lawyers who clerked for Roberts and clerked for Alito and clerked for Thomas inside DOGE doing this operation. I was reading about that this morning. But the idea of things like Administrative Procedures Act and things like appropriated and authorized congressional spending under law. The question everybody's asking is, what happens when Donald Trump gets a court order and just says, no, fuck you. No, I'm not doing it. I think we're already in a constitutional crisis. I think at that point it's a raving constitutional crisis. What happens with the courts? What is the court's option when he says, no, I'm not going to restore this $100 million of, medical funding to NIH that's authorized and approved by statute?
Right. Yeah. And the kicker is that I think one thing that's very, very important to note here is that when these court orders come down, they're not even the court orders saying, Trump administration, you lose. They're just the court orders to say, hang on. This is what an injunction or restraining order is. It's basically to say, hold up, everybody, freeze, stop what you're doing, nobody move. We're going to preserve the status quo until we actually finish deciding this case and its appeals and blah, blah, blah. And that is absolutely a prerogative of a federal judge to be able to come in and say, hold up, stop what you're doing. Don't actually dismantle that entire federal agency until we've actually decided whether or not you can. I think that the difference in the principle of that's not saying for Trump to ignore that court order is not to say that Trump might not ultimately win on the merits of the case. The principle that a court order should be, in fact, followed by the executive branch is separate from the principle of whether or not Donald Trump actually gets to dismantle that federal agency in question. Those are two separate things. And so I think you could see interesting things where the court says, hey, president actually has to follow those. You can't just ignore them. And then later in the same damn case turns around and says, actually, we think you can dismantle that on the merits. We think you can dismantle that federal agency. Goodbye, USAID. So we could see some interesting things there, but there have been a couple of moments in American history where this has really come to a head. We think about Andrew Jackson, that's one of them, but another one is with Harry Truman and he tried to seize America's steel mills during the Korean War. And you ended up with this case called Youngstown that basically was a was one of the most notable slaps back at presidential power by the Supreme Court ever. And I think that we could be there could be a moment here where, at least on the narrow issue of, look, when you get one of these court orders, yes, you have to follow it, and you're not allowed to go dismantling that federal agency until the case is over. That I have some hope that principle could be upheld. If it isn't, we are in very big trouble. Very, very big trouble.
That's my greatest fear is a court order comes down and says, thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt do this. And Trump says, nope, fuck off. And then what does the court, what power does the court have at that point? If they can't go have him arrested, really. I find it extremely disturbing knowing how boundless the executive types view power as, and how bounded the courts seem to view it as.
That's right. I look, the kicker there is okay, could you actually get it up to SCOTUS and then they come up with a decision that tells Trump, yes, in fact, you have to follow the court order. I believe that that's possible. Then what happens if Trump ignores that? If John Roberts is saying, yes, you have to follow this court order, is Trump, and what happens if Trump doesn't follow it? Yeah, that's where we're really then in like a DEFCON 1 constitutional crisis moment. Because we end up in a situation where like, what's the court going to do? Unfortunately, the only force that the courts can wield is the U.S. Marshals, but they're actually run by DOJ.
Right. So and I presume Pam Bondi, when she got a call from the court saying, you need to go and
serve a contempt order on Donald Trump, right, she's going to be like, nah.
Nope.
They already are refusing to sign a warrant for the arrest of Representative Mills, right? So that's a canary in the coal mine situation right there, where you've got a situation where the police, who often don't want to intervene in a domestic violence situation, are intervening and saying this guy should be arrested, and the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia is refusing to sign the warrant. Like, that definitely shows us where we might be headed here. But yeah, that's the thing. Bondi's just going to be like, no, I'm not going to order the marshals to go serve a contempt citation on Donald Trump.
It is one of the crowning ironies in my journey as a Republican to being an independent was that especially in the post-Tea Party era, all the Republicans had this mantra like, I'm a strict constitutionalist. I'm a strict constitutionalist. I believe the Constitution is not a living document. I believe it is the holy writ of the founders and cannot be. And now it's like, yeah, it means whatever Trump wants it to mean.
Right. They didn't mean it like that. They just take the plain language and just like, they're literally, now that the shoe's on the other foot, they want to use that shoe to just trample all over the Constitution as opposed to, before it was all about like,
the purity test, the purity stuff went away pretty quickly.
The purity stuff went away very quickly. The whole notion that like the text is what it is and you have to follow the text, or you have to follow the original intent of the founders. All of that is now out the window, because there's no possible way you could ever read any American history to say that the founders thought that untrammeled executive tyranny was something they wanted. It was actually the thing they hated and despised the most.
One of their biggest fears.
It was their biggest fear. Right?
It's I mean, just in the last few days, and this is because of Elon Musk and his pushing this idea. They're like, we have to impeach all these judges. The Constitution doesn't say anything about lower court judges having power over the president. I'm like, did y'all read the second half? And such inferior courts as may be established by Congress.
Correct. That's right.
And
there.
We've been doing that since 1789.
Yep. Yeah. It's a little bit tough. Yeah. And then again, you go back to the founders. It's like, when you've got laws that George Washington signed into law, it's like, and you're saying those shouldn't count. Like we're basically, they're ready to repeal the Judiciary Act of 1789. And it's like, really?
Sure
that's
about
what you
that?
Think? Are you sure about that? Like, yeah, but no, that's the thing. They just want to undo all of that. And actually they want to undo all of it, all of the checks, all of the balances, all of it.
Well, I this philosophy of, look, I was around for the early unitary executive sort of playing around with unitary executive theory during Bush, and even at that point, when you've got folks like Alberto Gonzalez saying, hey, y'all are way too far into the weeds now. This is not where you want to go. It has become, I almost think like calling it the unitary executive theory now is insufficient to describe how radical it
insufficient.
is.
Yeah, that's right. It's terribly, terribly insufficient, because it's basically a completely anti-constitutional, un-little r Republican, thought process entirely. It's completely unbounded monarchical dictatorial authority. That's what they're looking for. They want there to be no bounds at all on the power of the executive. And like, that's something that the English, fought a civil war over and then kind of figured out by the late 1600s. Like, that's how far back they're rewinding. Like, that's the problem with, calling it the unitary executive thing. And also it's just, that's a snoozer of a most legal doctrines sound like just, it's literally things that they came up with to cure insomnia. Like, that doesn't really do it. You can't call it that. It's not that anymore. So
yeah. And that balance of executive power and judicial power was, I think, fundamentally put on its head by the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States of America.
100%.
And I think that we have. I don't think the non-Trump part of the world has reconciled enough with how damaging that is. I think there is still a bit of like naive optimism out there sometimes, like, oh, don't worry, the courts won't let him do X. But let me ask one other question. This is one that somebody who I told I was interviewing today asked, how far down the chain does that protection of executive action go?
Yes, that is a good question. I was just about to say something about this. Not at all is the thing. The answer is not at all. Okay, there are
Take that, Stephen Miller.
There are some caveats in there. Okay,
sure.
Really, the kicker is that it does work for things that there is some qualified immunity for things that are definitively within the scope of one's powers, but it doesn't really go down. The notion that then you can't. Another thing is the notion that you can't indict a sitting president. That doesn't apply to anybody else. Even those deeply misguided Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel memos that are the problem there, that then a lot of this awful monstrosity of a doctrine has been built on, this like initially terribly misguided basis. Those decisions even specifically say that as to the vice president, that doctrine does not apply. A sitting vice president may be indicted.
Right.
They actually can be for federal crimes. As for then the question of the immunity, which is slightly separate, there is some qualified immunity for other government officials, but it's only when they're acting within the scope of their power. The kicker, and then you can have debates over like, was this something that was in their power to do? I think is to say Musk, when they won't even say that he actually is the administrator of DOGE. Which itself doesn't really, only sort of quasi maybe exists, but to the extent that it does, it didn't follow a lot of legal niceties that it was supposed to follow. The idea that he was running yesterday's cabinet meeting, despite the fact that he's not.
It was nice of him to invite it was nice of Elon to invite his vice president yesterday.
Right, exactly. So he's not a cabinet level official. He wasn't confirmed by the Senate. He shouldn't even be in the room, let alone running the meeting while Trump was falling asleep.
Right.
Like. The thing is that they've got enough of these people that are acting outside the scope of what their authority would ever be, that these people are on very, very dangerous turf legally. If I were their lawyers, I'd be like, like this is not good. Like you could really end up in a lot of legal hot water. Maybe not while this administration is in there, but the statute of limitations for some of these things could run long enough that then you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I know these people. I know these people. They are a combination of monomaniacal pursuit of weird ideological shit, corrupt. There's always money flowing between a lot of these people. There's always a grift. There's always a flim flam. There's always a scam. And they are people who are temperamentally going to abuse their powers and cause harm to people that will likely end up being actionable. Mm-hmm. And there will likely be people who are able to say, you are using the power of government in a way that is beyond your scope, and that was for the purposes of harassment, etc. I mean, I'm curious how far these investigations of, the announced investigation yesterday of Jim Comey. I'm curious how far these things go until they are quite evidently just meant to bankrupt these folks, and quite evidently meant to just cause them enormous, and as somebody who's like been on the receiving end of one of these lawfare ideas for 2 years now, it sucks. And I have resources and it still sucks. But I'm just curious how the Comeys of the world and these other people that are going to be put under the griddle. And look, Elon taking over the IRS, trust me, I'm expecting 1 million audits for the rest of my life. I think a lot of people are going to get are going to abuse power in ways that are both illegal and inappropriate. I think that is a piece of slightly optimistic news that they're not going to be covered under the same blanket umbrella as the president himself.
And there's also the fact that even the president and certainly all of these other people, there's not really a question, or at least there shouldn't be unless the Supreme Court wrecks this too, that civil liability is something that can happen to these people during their terms in office. Like that is like Trump can be sued in a civil suit.
So they don't get a kind of sovereign immunity deal out of this. They don't get some sort of magical waiver of civil liability.
They don't get magical waivers of these things. If they act outside the scope of their office, then they're definitely in very shaky territory, both for criminal and for civil liability. There's just really no doubt about it. And you know, we have to remember that even with that really horrible immunity decision, there was still this distinction between official and unofficial acts that has not been fully explored.
We haven't tested that yet, though.
We haven't tested that yet. I think it's going to get tested at some point, and we're going to have to see how that goes down. You know, based on the oral argument transcript and the opinions and whatnot, it would appear that, like, you know, Barrett, for one, is definitely not somebody who's ready to just be like, oh, this means that anything they do is legal. She seemed very concerned about like where that was going to go. Roberts got, you know, who knows? We're gonna run into that one too. But the key other case Supreme Court wise that talks about this on the civil side is Clinton versus Jones, and that's the case that then ultimately led to the Lewinsky scandal happening, because instead of shutting down the Paula Jones case, the Supreme Court actually voted 9-0 to say, nope, it can go forward. And that's probably going to get challenged at some point here, because someone's going to sue Trump with a civil suit in the next couple of years. He's going to try to shut it down based on this presidential immunity doctrine. And then you're going to end up with Clinton v. Jones basically back before the Supreme Court. And we're going to have to see whether or not they uphold it. It'll be very interesting to then watch Clarence Thomas, who voted in the 9-0 back 20 years ago, right, turning around and saying, like, now you can't touch a president, he's off limits. Of course he's going to do that.
Clarence Thomas, he may be an older and heavier fella now, but he is still one hell of a gymnast when it comes to that stuff.
Right. Yeah. So, although I actually don't think he's going to be around much longer. I think he's going to retire. I actually think he could retire this summer.
I'm getting the checking out vibe from Thomas. And
I think he could retire this summer, so that he can be replaced by a younger version of himself while Trump is in there. I actually believe that we will probably see both Thomas and Alito retire in the next few years, especially Thomas. He's got to go use all that luxury travel, right, and the fancy RV.
There are signs. Yeah, there are signs in conservative legal circles right now that they are on the hunt for the magical next Clarence Thomas.
Right. I think that could be the fun thing this summer that we'll all have to put up with as another nomination brouhaha. So
and Susan Collins will be very concerned about.
Oh, she'll be horribly concerned.
At the end, after clutching several strands of pearls, we'll vote for whoever it is. Even if the guy says, yes, I'm going to allow Trump to murder people in the street. So,
yeah.
Hey, well, Tristan Snell, my friend, as always, brother, it is great to have you on the show. Folks, TristanSnell.com leads to his excellent Substack, The Tristan Snell Show, his podcast. And you can catch him on all the usual social media platforms at Tristan Snell.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks. Talk to you soon,
pleasure.
Man.
Take care.
Likewise. All right, folks. Imagine for a moment that you're a Republican. Just imagine it for a moment. I know it's a difficult thing to do for some people. And imagine you grew up, maybe you're my age. Maybe you're 60, 61. You grew up during the Cold War. And you knew the whole time, you understood in your deepest gut that there was a reason the Russians called us the main enemy. There was a reason that we were always the target of the Russians. We were the main enemy. We were the country that represented everything they were not. That we were the country with the rule of law. We were the country that protected individual freedoms, imperfectly, to be sure. We were a country that stood in opposition to the depredations and the miseries and the oppression that was inherent in autocratic Soviet communism. And maybe if you're younger, you don't get that as much. Maybe if you're in your 30s or your 40s, you don't see it, you don't remember it because it wasn't wired into your life. I was born the day before JFK was killed. Let's put it that way. They give some historical context. And I grew up, and by the way, I was a Soviet studies guy, so I'm a little biased here. I grew up understanding who the Russians were. Now, I love Russians, but I hate communism. I love Russians, but I hate Putin. I hate the system that the Russian people have been subjected to for the last 100 years. More now. But now we have chosen evil as a country. We have chosen evil. We have decided that America is on the side of the inheritor state to the Soviet Union. Now, I do notice in the MAGA world, there is an instantaneous sensitivity to be, oh my God, communism, socialism, to everything. Anything you don't understand is communism. Everything you don't understand is socialism. I get that. But Putin represents something worse in my mind than communism. Communism is pretty fucking high up on my list of shitty things in the universe. Putin represents autocratic kleptocracy and oppression. And that's why Trump loves him the most. That's the secret sauce inside of the whole thing. That's why Trump really loves him the most. Okay? He loves the autocracy. He loves the oppression. He loves the idea that Putin gets to kill his political enemies. He loves the idea that there's no newspaper or TV outlet or social media outlet in Russia that isn't controlled by the Russian government. I won a legal case in the last year and a half, in part based on the fact that RT is, in fact, an arm of the Russian government. None of this makes any sense to people who understood what communism and oppression was under the Soviet Union. None of this makes any sense to people who understood that autocracies and dictators and autocrats are the enemies of freedom everywhere. That the idea of an all-powerful central executive is an enemy of the American values that every one of us grew up with, in my generation at least. Call me tail end of the baby boomers, call me the beginning of Gen X, whatever you want to do. But there are people in this country who know and are now playing a game, pretending that Donald Trump is some sort of tactical or strategic or diplomatic genius because he pissed on Zelensky in the Oval Office and he's beating his chest and he loves Putin and he's going to reset the game and he's going to make the world a tripartite world where China gets Asia and Russia gets Europe and we get the rest. It's more pathetic than that. It's much more pathetic and weak-dicked than that. He's been manipulated. He's been conned. He's been played. He thinks he's this major player. He thinks he's this sort of like super negotiator. He never has been. I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, way before I was an anti-Trump guy, by the way, way before, Trump's doing some real estate deal down in South Florida. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here, but one of the guys that's in this deal is a client of mine. And calls me up one day and goes, hey, you lived in New York. You ever dealt with Trump? I'm like, I met him a couple times when I worked for Rudy, but I don't know him personally. Met him 3 times, I guess, total. The guy says to me, well, we're in this deal with him, and I'm really afraid we're going to get rolled over. He's like, he's a super negotiator. And he goes, I'm afraid my partner's going to get rolled over. I was like, back then, Rudy basically used to not like the guy. He just said, give him a couple parking passes every year. At the time, Rudy was like, I deal with the real real estate developers in New York, of which Trump was like number 60 on a list of those people. Anyway, these guys go into this deal and they're thinking, oh, the magic mojo of Trump, art of the deal. They named a huge number and he goes, okay, and walks out of the room. He's not a good negotiator. He never has been a good negotiator. He's a fucking idiot. And he got rolled by Putin. Now, does he like the things Putin represents? Absolutely. Does he want to emulate Putin? Absolutely. But Putin, for all his evil, is brilliant. And he is having the moment of all moments. We're going to look back in history and we're going to look at this period where World War III started. My theory is starting to really come together. And we're going to say to ourselves, oh my fucking God. He was on his last legs. He had destroyed Russia's economy. He destroyed Russia's military. He burned Russia in the eyes of the world. and America bailed out Putin. Now, this is a long story to get around to a point about somebody on the enemies list this week. And it's Marco Rubio. Known Marco for a long time, supported Marco for a long time, and I'm deeply ashamed of it. For Senate, against Charlie Crist, and for president. Hell, a bunch of guys in Silicon Valley came together and thought, we want to do an outside Marco super PAC. I'm like, I'm your Huckleberry. Last week, Marco Rubio sat on that couch in the Oval Office, inert, impotent, spineless, helpless. You could see his soul withering away as this went on. Because I'll tell you something, and I believed this, and I think Marco believes it too. I think he still believes it. If you go back and look at Marco's speeches when he ran for Senate, when he ran for president, and in the Senate, Marco over and over and over again was one of the most articulate modern voices against oppressive states and oppressive regimes and oppressive leaders in the world. Whether it was the Cuban government or Maduro in Venezuela or Putin himself, Marco was one of the most articulate voices out there. I think one of the greatest sins in public life is to have the power to articulate something in a way that is positive and that moves people, and to turn that skill to evil. And last week you saw Marco turn that skill to evil. As Secretary of State, he is now playing the Fox game, playing the Trump game. He's out there jerking himself off on live TV, saying, oh, he should have treated Trump with more respect. And I tweeted the other day that if Marco Rubio believed in any of the things he'd previously spoken about for decades now, if he had any residual sense of honor or dignity or shame, he would resign as Secretary of State. And in related news, Marco Rubio will not resign as Secretary of State. The men enabling him, and Mike Waltz, by the way, similar but lesser case, the men enabling him right now, men enabling Vladimir Putin's takeover of American foreign policy, the men enabling Vladimir Putin to put America on the side of darkness and evil and oppression and the conquering of Europe, one bit at a time, are guys like Marco Rubio. Donald Trump is old. He's sick. He's going to die. He will be gone from our lives at some point. But the people who empowered him and the people who enabled him and the people who, like Marco and like Mike Waltz and like Lindsey Graham, they will be on the enemies list, not just for me, but I think for humanity for a very long time.